If you are relying on social media to create revenue in your business, it is like playing Russian roulette. They can shut you down in an instant, or worse off, you could be hacked and someone takes control of your message. It happens all of the time. I can't tell you how often somebody reaches out to me in a panic because their business has literally come to a grinding halt because their social media has gone offline. So today I'm super excited on Amplify Your Marketing Message to be talking with our guest. Please give a very warm welcome to Mary Chen. We're going to be talking about how to create your own media platform so that you actually control the conversation. Mary, welcome to our program.
Christine, thank you so much for having me.
I am so excited about this because Mary and I have crossed paths a couple of times, and she is a podcast strategist and someone who also is like the voice of radio. And she had all kinds of great nuggets for me about sound because she runs a company called Organized Sound Productions. But I want to start off by let's talk about the world of podcasting. Why podcast? And talk to us about what's the advantage of amplifying your message through this kind of medium.
Yeah, when you said voice of radio, I was like, oh, right, because my background is in radio. And when I was in radio, what people don't really realize is that it's not all speaking off the cuff and, off the top of your head what you want to say. In radio, because you are usually in, like, say, your traditional sense, there's a larger hierarchy to it. You're always told what to say, when to say it, and how to say it. So everything is already pre-planned before you ever turn on that microphone. And in podcasting, which is very similar, right? Audio formats. But when you hit record on that microphone, it is your content, how you want to say it, and for how long that you want to say it as well. You control everything, including how it gets out into the world. So it's not as restricted as traditional media like in radio.
It's absolutely. And this is a really important one because as I said when we started off, you're renting space on other people's platforms. But it doesn't mean necessarily that you need to go and create your own show, does it?
No. And people ask me that all the time. They're like, "Well, you help people launch podcasts, but what if I don't want one? Like what do I do?" And the beautiful thing about podcasting is that you don't have to have your own show to leverage the power of it. You can be a guest. So already um being on an established show that already has a network, you can grow your own community that way. So you're being a guest on other people's show and you're sharing your message and your stories still through your voice and not having to produce the whole thing yourself too as well.
I think it's a great way to start. And often when I'm working with my own clients in the Business Scale Accelerator, one thing I talk about is leveraging other people's platforms. Because the truth is, your revenue is directly tied to how many people you know, or how many people know about you, what you do, and how you might be able to serve them. When you're first starting out, we all start with zero. We all
Yes.
grow one at a time. Let's not forget that. So, getting onto other people's platforms that are already established can be a great accelerator to seeing success in your pathway. I've said you control the speed, but finding an audience is non-negotiable.
Yeah, and I always say too, like, if you're not quite sure, it's being a guest is such a great way to just dip your toe into the industry and to figure out, okay, this is how one person produces their show. This is how another show does it. And you can then pick and choose what you like and then create your own platform and have that thought leadership and that space for you to share your message in the way that you wanted versus being on a guest on another show is great because you do get to start from zero and grow your network. But as you then establish your own show and have your own platform, you get to facilitate that message versus being on somebody else's show. You kind of talk about the same stories, um, typically in the same way, but on your own show, you get to change the content whenever you want.
This is true. Ultimate freedom when you have your own show. However, it's not everyone's first idea. And in fact,
Yeah.
it often is one that scares the living bejesus out of people. When I say, come on, you've got to get into events. Events are awesome because they're experiential. If you're looking to attract a high ticket client or a high paying offer that you want to present, experiencing someone for more than a nanosecond by reading a post is essential. So, talk to us about the expectations around podcasting? Is it a short game? Is it a long game? How do you control the speed at which you start to build this audience? What are some best tips and practices as you see them from your chair?
Yeah, podcasting, first of all, is a definite long game. This is an extension of your brand. It is part of your message, and it needs to be repeated quite a few times in order for people to really hone in on what you're saying. And it's the know, like, and trust factor, right? Like
Mm.
on a podcast, if it's 30 minutes long, 10 minutes long, an hour long, however long you are on an episode, people are listening to you for most of that time. Like you were saying, what, a nanosecond on a blog post or a social media caption, right? But on podcasting, the average consumption time, they'll listen to about 60, 70, 80% of an entire episode. So, if you're looking at that in terms of a consumption rate, podcasting is the highest in all forms of media, social media, things like that. So it is a long game. You do need to establish yourself and make sure that there is a clear message that you can repeat from time to time so that people do get that in their head. And much like when I worked in radio, it was always about repetition. When you heard that same message over and over again, it isn't until the listener is thinking, oh, you know what? I do need some coaching program now. I'm ready for it now. I've been listening to you and I've been absorbing all this message, but now it's time for me to work with you. So that's when they make that action and they start working with you.
I think that's such fabulous advice for the audience because people often think, it's just going to take us a heartbeat. I said a nanosecond. I'm all about the really shortness of it.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing, that's why podcast fatigue is real. A lot of people start it without a clear expectation, do not understand this is a long game, aren't clear on their message. So really start to have anybody and anything on their show when you do get to that level, and then wonder why it's not leading to the impact you
Mhm.
want, which in many cases is income or impact and more conversations around your offers. And I think this insight that you're sharing is reset your expectations. Most people say the podcast fatigue, people stop at 12 episodes because they're not sure where they're going.
Yeah.
If you start and work with a professional such as yourself or others that are out there in the industry, it's suddenly realizing what is the strategy behind this. And I love that you say it's part of the overall message, it's part of the overall ecosystem, and it can be a great accelerator, but it is about the whole. And that's why we say we're creating a media platform. We're not just podcasting here. We're looking at multiple ways to get our own message out in our own pathways. So let's start back at the guest side. What makes a great guest, or what are some things you should do to get yourself that good reputation to be a bookable guest?
First of all, having all your assets in place. I find a lot of hosts are looking for guests and then they're like, "Oh, I think you'd be great on the show." But then the guest is like, "Oh, I don't know. Do you want to talk about this or maybe that? I got to find my headshot. I don't know where a good photo. Oh, I don't know about my good photo. And oh, you want a bio? Oh man, like oh, I got to type one out." Make sure you have all your assets in place beforehand. So it's easy for you to just go from podcast to podcast to podcast and submit to them your little pieces of information that pretty much every podcast host is looking for. So knowing your message is very important, first of all, and then having your assets. And then secondary to that as well, number one in my mind, because I love audio, having a good microphone. A good microphone can help propel your brand because having great sound, I kind of equate it to like going to a restaurant. When you go to a restaurant, you might like Google or whatnot, and you're like, oh, this is pretty good. And you roll up to the restaurant and you see the signage and you see the menu and you're like, yeah, everything looks great. But the sound part is when the food gets to your table and you take a bite and you're like, oh, this doesn't really taste as good as it looks. So having great sound will help enhance part of your brand. So getting an external microphone, or if you don't even have a budget for an external microphone, they don't really have to be expensive. They can be like $100, even cheaper when they're on sale. But recording in a quiet space, time and time
Mhm.
again, I've been editing shows or listening to shows and I hear like a leaf blower in the background, or The dogs are barking, which, if dogs are part of the podcast, great, sure. But most of the time, they're a distractor because when people are listening to podcasts, most of the time they are listening without a video component. So it's usually audio only so that they can go for a walk, go for a hike, commute, doing the dishes, vacuuming, things like that. They're multitasking. And so they're not watching. And so they need to
Mhm.
have a full immersive audio experience. And when your audio is great, they'll continue to listen and come back to that restaurant and have another meal versus, it wasn't so great to begin with. I'm not going back to that restaurant. Same with podcasting.
And this is
Yeah.
a great one. And I know actually the fact I even have a little mini mic here now came from part of the conversation you and I had, which was if you're going to be in this, talk about the first impression. And I know we've had some
Mm,
episodes here on this podcast here that talks about the first impression. It's like show up as a professional. And that's both as a guest and as a host. And a little bit of investment makes a really big difference to the impression and to the fact that, yes, I am the expert who happens to be speaking on this topic. The other real good nugget I just heard you say was, know what you want to talk about, because I see it time and time again, hosts looking for guests. And it's like, I have an agenda as the guest. And the most important thing is not that you have an agenda, is that you serve the guest as a role to be of service to the host. And I think this is really interesting because I know when I'm looking at people to come onto this platform, I'm like, what do you have to say that's relevant to my audience? Not that, hey, I've got something I want to talk about. It's like, how would this relate to who I want to serve, who I've built this audience around? I think there's a mismatch and you will see more bookings if you can dial that in.
mhm, for sure.
So, what makes, do you think, on the other side, a great host?
Well, the tips for the guest also reflect for the host.
Like, that's good to know. It's
Yeah.
reassuring.
Yeah. However, another thing about the host is like a little bit back to what you were saying before, 10 to 12 episodes in, and if you can get beyond that hump of your own episodes, then you're well on your way. But a lot of the times, especially during when the pandemic first hit, everybody's like, ooh, podcasting is the next big thing. I'm going to go start one. We're looking at the stats now, and we're seeing a lot of shows have dropped off, not even past like the 10 mark. It's 3 episodes. And then they're like, oh, this is a lot more work than I thought. And so going into having your own show, know that just like running your business, there needs to be a clear workflow and a workflow that works for your capacity. So, not just saying, okay, I'm told all the time I need to create content. So I'm going to have a weekly show. And, typically it's 60 minutes. So I'm going to go do that because that's what everyone else is doing. No, take a step back before you plug in that microphone and start talking. Figure out why you're podcasting. What's the strategy behind it? And then the number one thing is to actually figure out your ideal listener. And that could be similar to your ideal client. But remember, podcast listeners are slightly different. So you want to figure out how they listen, who are they, why are they listening to your show? And that way you'll get clear on how to podcast, meaning
Mhm.
what are you going to talk about, the specific content that will drive action, how long your podcast should be, the graphic that you'll create. It's all about your ideal listener.
I love that. So many awesome tips, because this is something that if you have not thought of in your journey to date, we hope today we've sparked the imagination that this could be possible. Toe in maybe as a guest, but really look at how you're creating your own media platform, because you're at high risk anytime you're borrowing somebody else's platform, somebody else's agenda. And at the end of the day, nothing moves in your business unless you set the intentional strategy to follow through. And the best tip I heard, for sure, it's one I'm really aware of, is this business evolves as my show evolves, is watch your capacity. This is something that is about consistency, which is, so important. That's why we hear about it 1,000 times a day. Set the intention, follow through, because your audience is going, what comes next? Hey, I heard this good program. It was interesting. You got to check out what comes next. You want to have a very clear through line on what that looks like. So I want to know, because this is a really important part of what I think people really need, is what's working now. How do you amplify what's working now in your business? What's the thing that's really driving success as we lead into the new year?
people, at least in where I am, we're really coming out of the whole staying at home thing. So we're going out. We're actually going out to conferences. Things are happening again. And I think people are forgetting to talk about yourself. So when
Mm.
you are a guest on a show, or if you have your own podcast, you need to talk about it. The industry really works best on word of mouth. So knowing that when you meet someone or when they're like, oh, how can I find out more about you? You're like, you know what? I have a podcast. You can learn all about me and what I do, or you can learn all about like all the guests I have on or what have you. Show them how to get to listen to your show. Or when people say, oh, this sounds great. Can you tell me more about yourself? You're like, you know what? I was a guest on this podcast. It really showcases my story. I'm going to send you the link to that. So then they get to
Mm.
know you even more outside of the one on one.
I think this is awesome. This is all a part of the joy of reciprocity. We are, as hosts and as people who are experts who like to speak, we're always saying, who do you know who's great, who's got a point of view that we want to share? Hey, I was great and I shared this. This is actually going to be happening in my real life this week. I've been invited to an event. The speaker is actually somebody who I've been on their podcast. And I thought, I have never met them in person. And I didn't even know they were local to me. So snap, right? How did we miss
Yeah.
this? But this is such an important thing. Mary, it's absolutely amazing to have you as our guest. How do people learn more about what you do?
Well, like I just said, you can talk about your podcast.
Awesome.
So if you'd like to listen to my podcast, it is called The Podcaster's Guide to a Visible Voice. You can look up Visible Voice on all your listening apps, and it's the one with the purple logo. Check me out there or also on my website, organizedsound.ca.
Absolutely, guys. She's a great resource. She's really influenced me on my journey. She's an awesome woman to know in your network. So think about creating your own media platform and using this to control the voice that you get out into the market. When you do that, you can amplify your marketing message. Mary, thanks very much for being our guest. Guys, we will see you on our next episode. Look forward to seeing you on the inside.